The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio. I'm your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. Joining us today is my partner and lovely co-host, Leah Shaper. You are muted.
Oops. Hello.
Oh, there we go. We got a great show in store. We got a lot of topics to talk about. The first one we're going to go over is Solar Max. We're at Solar Max, and there's some solar activity coming off of the sun. We'll discuss the significance of a recently reported X14 off the backside of the sun, not Earth-facing. And so that doesn't get recorded as an X flare in our current solar cycle. Did you know that?
I think I was kind of aware of that.
Yeah. So only when it's an Earth-facing or on the limb do they actually write it down as a solar flare for the solar cycle, because we're recording solar flares that affect Earth. We don't care about.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and you could argue, right, also that if it's off the backside of the sun, that our measurements and instrumentation may not entirely be accurate, correct?
Well, we've got tons of satellites now in all positions and Lagrange points, so we have good ways of estimating off the backside what those are.
Well,
and we also want to put some monitors up on planets like Mars.
Right, right. But didn't I read that the Solo satellite was in direct line of this CME?
Yeah, Soho was.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so was Mercury.
Right.
It's a little too hot to put an instrument on Mercury,
right?
Because it would melt.
Yeah.
A paper just came out. Did you hear this? That there is a 10-mile thick crust of diamonds on Mercury?
No, I did not hear that.
Yeah, we may be mining Mercury soon.
I'm sure De Beers will be leading that venture.
No, we don't. There's no purpose to go mine diamonds on a planet.
But you know, we're humans and we have weird senses. I mean, the whole idea of incredible value behind diamonds is largely just made up, right? I mean, there's a lot of diamonds.
They hide all the diamonds in a warehouse and don't tell anybody to have them, and there's this false scarcity.
Right, right.
So make sure you spend 1/3 of your salary on your diamond when you get married. All right, we're going to also be discussing the most culturally significant advancement in humanity ever, and it is the use of red ochre. Wow, there's a bug in here. I'm in a barn. So red ochre, a lot of people think they know something about it. They think they know about the red paint people or the red ochre people, and they've heard myths or mythology that it goes all the way back to the Clovis people who were buried with red ochre in their burials. 13,000. Wow. The truth is, red ochre goes back hundreds of thousands of years, and not just Homo sapiens were using it. All hominids were using it as early as hominids existed. And there was a very early phase of red ochre use, guess what, which coincided with one of the largest magnetic excursions in modern history, and then another phase coinciding with another magnetic excursion, and you get the picture what I'm getting at there.
Mm-hmm. I do.
And
sure
currently,
we'll explain in more detail.
Yeah, currently on Earth, there are still tribes in Africa that use red ochre daily in their hair, for their hair and their skin, like the Himba tribe. We'll talk about all that and more. And if we have time, we'll get to the fact that the newest telescope blowing minds, the James Webb Space Telescope, is confirming that we have no idea how old the universe is. And astrophysicists have discovered like thousands of galaxies that are only supposed to be a few thousand years old, which literally take millions of years to form, and there's a big problem with the 13.8 billion year old universe idea.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've always purported, I think that you would agree with me, that the universe is probably infinite without a starting point.
That's what I believe.
And we also believe that time is a localized effect, where time is only happening in these three dimensions that we biological entities are experiencing. And outside of those three dimensions, there is no time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot to take in there, isn't it? Well, let's start off with talking about some of the current space weather happening on the sun. Today was a busy day. Actually, yesterday, AR 3762 and AR 3766 produced a series of M-class solar flares. They were impulsive, but they did generate coronal mass ejections. It is the longer duration CMEs that have more effects on Earth and bigger solar storms. So these impulsive CMEs, if they do reach Earth, and they are currently being modeled, but we do have the SOHO imagery, which shows 3 coronal mass ejections. One off to the left here. This is a backside X1 they're estimating. And then if you look, there are 2 halo CMEs there and there inside of each other. 2 in a row. Boom, then boom, boom.
Mm-hmm.
Those 2 halo CMEs are coming from these sunspots facing us.
Interesting.
And that suggests that there are 2 solar storms headed directly our way. There and there. And it's going to take about 6 more hours until they can model it. So by tonight, when this is being replayed on Magnetic Reversal News, those models will be up.
Yeah.
But what we want to get at is the X14 that was just modeled off the backside several days ago. It is, in fact, registering as the largest X flare front or backside of the entire solar cycle. Now, is that significant? Did you look at the data? Do you think that that's a significant flare?
I mean, all things considered, I mean, we've had similarly sized X flares. We had like an X12, didn't we?
Here is the top X flares for solar cycle 25. There have been over 50 X flares ranging from X1 all the way to X8.79. The 8.79 was a limb X flare, and it didn't even affect Earth.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I want to draw your attention to it, some people are claiming if an X14 hits us, Earth-facing, it could be a doomsday scenario. That couldn't be further from the truth, and this is all based on evidence. Let's go back to solar cycle 24. Much stronger
that's where I'm getting X12
24.
from.
And so solar cycle 25 is a little stronger than 24 was. And we have much larger X flares, 3 stronger X flares than the current cycle. So that means we may still have some larger X flares facing Earth.
Sure.
None of these X flares fried the grid during solar cycle 24. Do you remember any of them frying the grid?
Nope.
And that were 2011, 2017. Let's take it back to a huge solar cycle, cycle 23. And what do you notice?
I can't see the data very well.
The X flares on a large solar cycle are much stronger than anything we're seeing now.
Yeah.
The top 10 flares go from X10 to X40 with an X11.9, an X12.9, an X12.9, an X14.3, an X20.6, an X24.4, an X28.5, and an X40 plus, all Earth facing during solar cycle 23. Did we die?
Nope.
And what can be said is that 20 years ago, during this solar cycle, 25 years ago, the magnetic field wasn't that much stronger.
Yeah.
So the reduction since then has been maybe 5-10%. So I think that we can sustain up to an X40 and we would still see the grid holding up, albeit there would be problems.
There'll be little pockets of issues. I mean, even the and I forget what year that was, the Quebec power plant incident. What year was that?
Uh,
90 something or 89? They're at 89.
89.
I mean,
The March 89 geomagnetic storm.
right. So, I mean, kind of a big deal, but obviously it didn't take down the entire grid by any measure. Not even close.
Right. It says the most extreme storm of the space age by several measures outed power grids of the province of Quebec. So what do we have to compare it to? Well, let's go back to March 1940. There was an X35 plus. And this caused significant interference to all communications at the time. We weren't very technologically advanced in the 40s, so we've got some electricity and some communications. We don't even have satellites at this point. So even an X35 didn't fry the grid. It only affected communications.
Right.
In 67, there was another huge X flare, blackout of polar surveillance radars during the Cold War. So that must have been freaky.
Yeah.
Might think that the Russians are doing something.
Right.
The fastest CME transit time ever recorded was in August 1972 solar storm, with the most extreme solar particle event by some measures and the most hazardous to human spaceflight during the space age. There were severe technological disruptions and caused accidental detonations of numerous magnetic influence sea mines.
Oh dear. Why are there mines just sitting in the sea? I don't get that.
Cold War, probably
Right.
70s.
Yeah.
The world is a very scary, dangerous place. Then we have the Bastille solar storm in July of 2000. It caused by an X8 solar flare aimed directly at Earth. So it's the angle of the dangle too. How close is it facing us? Are we just going to get clipped by the plasma, or is this baby coming right at us?
Sure, there's a lot of different characteristics for any solar flare that are going to impact whether or not it affects us.
Right. The October 2003 solar storm, that is cycle 23. We were just looking at. That's the X40 plus. This was among the few most intense storms of the space age. Aurora was visible as far south as Texas and the Mediterranean throughout Europe. And this was a solar flare with X-ray flux estimated to be around X45.
Worth noting as well that it was directed away from Earth.
Right, and still caused auroras all the way to the equator.
Right.
So we are coming to a conclusion here that it seems to be around X40 Earth-facing big problems. And I'm just going to stick with that. I think that because of the superstorm, the May superstorm of this year, let's get to that down here. May 2024 solar storm. What happened here was a sequence of smaller X flares, X1.2, X1.3, X4.5, all overlapping, causing a prolonged event. And so we could see the same thing, let's say with X10s and maybe an X20 overlapping. That could also be big problems for Earth as far as the grid and technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this goes to show, prove the point that I just said about, there's so many different characteristics of any particular flare or set of flares that determine its effect on us. So the May solar storms of this year, had a similar impact, let's say, in terms of aurora that the X45 that was directed away from Earth had, right? So there's obviously numerous characteristics that determine the outcome for us.
Exactly. Agreed. But what we should glean from going over this information just in the last 100 years is that these major storms happen all the time.
Sure.
It doesn't matter if you're in a big solar cycle or a small solar cycle. So people are saying like, well, when is the big event going to happen? It can happen anytime.
There's no real ability to predict anything within this. I mean, sure, we could predict that right now we are more likely to be affected by any particular solar outburst just based solely on the weakness of our magnetic field compared to, let's say, 30 years ago.
Right. And
But that's
there's
about as far as
also
it goes.
there's also a probability that is listed daily on the solar flare threat.
Right.
Today
Based
we have
on
a
the magnetic
10%
complexity of
chance.
each of the sunspots.
Right. So today we have a 10% chance of ending the Earth. Right here. But there's
It's
a
just 10%,
60%,
but it's still a chance.
right,
Always.
there's a 60% chance that we'll just get some aurora.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we know. When is the Earth going to end? Well, there's a 10% chance it would be today.
We're living on the edge all the time, which maybe is why people wear so much red ochre.
Well, that's a great segue. Red ochre as skin and hair sunblock. Now, here's funny. In my research on this topic, I uncovered lots of old archaeological videos with stodgy old white men. And they describe the use of red ochre as hocus pocus and magic. Right.
It's just ritual. It's just
hocus pocus is a quote.
It's so insulting, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
I was reading some of these articles that you sent me, and I just find them tremendously insulting. And they're like, and they go, "Oh wow, look, red ochre is it's a sign of people being able to think, that they had cognitive ability." Wow. It's like, it's back to this thing where every hominid and every ancestor of ours had to be much stupider than we are today.
Exactly.
It's so arrogant.
Right. And here in this article, it says red ochre as a skin hair sunblock is an old Himba discovery going back to the 1800s.
No, try like 500,000 years ago.
Yeah, so disingenuous. Here is a Himba girl with the red ochre in her hair and on her skin. And these people, if you Google pictures of the Himba, they have their skin is flawless. Mm-hmm. None of them have like acne or anything. Look at the skin on this person here. Yeah. Their hair is incredible. I wonder if it has to do with the red ochre. And here's what I'm getting at here and why we may have started using this. It may have been through an accident. Like someone gets mud on themselves and it has a cooling effect in the hot sun. And they're like, hey, let's rub it all over. But then they try experimenting with different things. And they find that this red ochre, which is readily available everywhere, has specific properties. And it has to do with the fact that it's mostly contains hematite, which is mostly iron and oxygen. Mm-hmm. And so it might have something to do and everything to do with the iron inside of the pigment that had such a benefit from protecting against the sun.
Well, let me throw something else out there too, because when you apply red ochre like this to the skin, it looks like typically what was done is the ochre was mixed with animal fat, which we know that, for example, beef tallow, which I've been touting lately, is amazing for the skin. So the health benefit to the hair and skin may have also something to do with the animal fat. However, it's very specific. The ochre, right? There's other colors of ochre. There's yellow ochres and brown ochres, but what is really sought out is the red ochre, which we know works as a sunscreen. And I suspect that the color is really important for that, for diffusing wavelengths of light, the red in particular. So but there may also be a benefit to the actual minerals, the iron and the oxygen, as you point out.
Yeah, and so some of the studies claim that the use of sunscreens or these types of pigments on the skin and the hair go back to 8,000 years ago. And again, there are other studies that show this has been used hominids have used or been associated with red ochre since the first hominid skeletons were found.
Yeah. But yet we are still acting as though there are only certain groups that used this, and it appears to be much more widespread than that. And also to your point about, perhaps this was an accidental discovery that like somebody ended up sort of covered in a red ochre mud and discovered that it was cooling and sun protective, but also it may have been observationally based. Like we've talked about this on the show before, that there's a hippo that actually sweats red and it acts as a sunblock for that hippo. So there may have been an observational element to this discovery as well.
I agree. And believe it or not, some of the sunscreens we still use today originate from ancient methods of sun protection dating back hundreds of thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, most companies have chosen to stray from the tried and true indigenous knowledge of mineral and plant-based sunscreens, and now they opt for synthetic chemicals like benzene.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
Which themselves have been linked to skin cancer. So it's brilliant.
Right. So to prevent skin cancer, you need to slather your skin in cancer.
Right.
Brilliant.
Because people just slather themselves with red ochre just for the hell of it. Just for ritualistic / religious / superstitious purposes.
It's hocus pocus. This is quoted by an archaeologist. All right, we know the beneficial effects of moderate sunlight exposure are numerous, and several positive correlations exist between adequate UVR exposure and the synthesis of vitamin D3 and its effects on human fertility. So if you don't get out in the sun enough, low fertility. What are we seeing on Earth? Not people staring into squares, staying in their homes, and we're seeing low fertility.
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
I mean, there's lots of reasons for that, but I'm sure that plays a part.
Yes. And the fact that vitamin D, the active form being dihydroxy vitamin D or D3, this is the one you need. It reduces the incidence of rheumatoid arthritis, coronary heart disease, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, rickets, schizophrenia, autoimmune disease, and several types of cancer.
And is just generally a huge boost to your immune system.
And you need vitamin K in concert for it to be bioavailable and effective.
Well, another thing that is interesting about vitamin D is that you can view vitamin D as being more of a hormone than a vitamin. It's actually very similar and related to the production of, say, cortisol, which is also related to all of the sex hormones. All of those things are intertwined. Melatonin, cortisol, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, they're all linked together, and they're all linked to vitamin D, probably thus why this plays a role in the fertility element. So, I mean, it's an active compound that is affecting numerous systems in your body, at like a hormonal level, not just a like nutritive level.
Now, wherein we just described to you the benefits of moderate sun exposure, there are also detrimental effects if you have too much sun exposure.
And especially if you're someone like me with
pale
fair skin.
But tribes in Africa that live out in the middle of the flat in their huts, they're in the sun constantly. Mm-hmm. And so they probably developed these techniques to allow the perfect amount of sun exposure and the perfect amount of protection so that they could be healthy. How they knew what this perfect amount was is going to take decades of research, because we still think, old people dumb.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and another thing about this that's sort of interesting. I mean, last week we reviewed a paper about, the role of melanin in the skin in terms of protection and skin cancer. And there's a lot of it's all about sort of having the right amounts of things. But one of the things that came out of that was melanin's impact on basically the wavelength of light that your skin is receiving. And so in that sense, the red ochre is going to play a role in that as well, right? That's going to shift and scatter the light. So it may be that the red ochre also plays a role in melanin production, which then plays a role in the protective effect on the skin.
And yeah, and even more interesting, a little side note here, we're going to get into some of the cultural significance. We have a paper that studies the use of red ochre in Africa, but there are the red paint people, there are red ochre people, and they're not all the same people. They're different cultures that are called the same thing. In Finland and in Scandinavia, for thousands of years, there were a group of people referred to as the red ochre people. These are pale white people that have rubbing red ochre on their skin. And where did they learn it from? Why is the whole world using this? It's ubiquitous. Everyone knows to go find the red ochre and put it on their skin and their hair.
But yet it's just ritual.
It's hocus pocus. That's the... But what we've seen in the last few years is innumerable papers, peer-reviewed, that suggest excessive ultraviolet radiation may have influenced evolutionary processes on Earth. Just like our friend Robert Felix, who wrote the book, Magnetic Excursions and Evolutionary Leaps. These ultraviolet evolutionary processes are triggered by magnetic excursions. The deeper the excursion, the more UVR enters the picture. And then we have, depending on how severe the excursion is, we can have extinction events, such as the disappearance of the megafauna during the Younger Dryas event and the extinction of megafauna and hominids like Neanderthals during the Lechamp magnetic excursion. So I wonder, and it took me 5 seconds to assess this. I was like, I wonder if there is a connection between magnetic field and the emergence of red ochre.
Right.
And so I just took up one of the older charts, which comes from seafloor data. This goes back 780,000 years to the last magnetic reversal, which is the Matuyama-Bruns magnetic reversal. 780,000 years ago, polarity shifted on Earth, and it has stayed the way it is ever since, except for slight excursions, like the Pringle Falls, the Big Lost, the Blake, and the Lechamp. So if you can't see if you're listening on the radio, and I implore you guys all to rewatch this tonight on YouTube on Magnetic Reversal News. There is a dotted line here at a threshold of the VADM, which is a method of measuring Earth's field strength. And it seems that when we fall below 4, we go into extinction level events.
Right.
Where the ultraviolet radiation is so high that bad things happen on Earth. Now, the first extinction level event occurred 780,000 years ago during the Bruns-Matuyama reversal. But there's no evidence of any mass extinction during the reversal. I find that interesting.
That's fascinating.
So something was preventing extinction from happening during the reversal. And it wasn't so quick that no one noticed. It did last for thousands of years here, as you can see in the chart.
Right.
There is evidence of extinction for the Big Lost, the Pringle Falls, and the Lechamp, but not the Blake. So there must be something that has to line up for the extinction level event to occur.
Very interesting.
But let's get into some of the science on the emergence of red ochre. And the paper we're going to reference came out at the end of 2022. It's the emergence of habitual ochre use in Africa and its significance for the development of ritual behavior during the Middle Stone Age. It's almost like racist, the title.
Yeah.
They're assuming these people are dumb and they're just using red paint in a ritual.
Right. And they're just doing it because it's become habit and that's what everybody else was doing. I mean, granted, there clearly are ritual purposes behind red ochre, right? There's countless examples of people being burials being covered in red ochre. There's a cave in Spain that includes, hand stencils using red ochre and stalactites that are painted in ochre that's like 65,000 years old. There's obviously it is being used for ritual purposes, but that doesn't mean that that was its only purpose. And it makes more sense to think that it had a functional component, thus was regularly available in people's lives, and it is a pigment, and then it becomes also something that is ritualistic. And perhaps this helps just generally preserve its use by repeatedly using it, so maybe 20,000 years later, when we've forgotten what the function was, we're still using it, and therefore it's still providing some protection.
I like that thought. And I would agree with that because we're still using it today, some tribes.
Right.
And we're not really in a deep magnetic excursion where it is required or we'll all die of cancer.
I mean, it would be extremely useful and is extremely useful, let's say in African deserts, right? Like in Namibia with the Himba people, right? They're living in a very extraordinarily dry, hot, sunny desert. So it's going to be very useful there.
Yeah, I agree. And if we go look at the history of what was going on in Africa through this paper, they did a study on all the archaeological sites known on the entire continent. And then they did some, unfortunately, computer modeling. But what they determined was that there were 3 phases of ochre use in Africa. The initial phase occurred from 500,000 years ago to 330,000 years ago. The emergent phase was 330,000 to 160,000. And then the habitual phase, 160,000 to 40,000. Now, they call it the habitual phase because 1/3 of all of the archaeological sites, 160,000 years or younger, contain red ochre. That's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And
but it's just a ritual.
It's hocus pocus. So this emergent phase is 160,000, or the habitual phase is 160,000. Which begins right here at the Pringle Falls Magnetic Excursion, which is deeper than the Lechamp or the Big Lost. And so this would have been a very difficult time on Earth. And there's a good reason why 1/3 of the people are found with red ochre in their burials, because everyone was probably using it to stay alive.
Mm-hmm.
And then they continued to use it even though they didn't need to for tens of thousands of years. But it probably came back in use 110,000 years ago during the Blake. And they knew why. They knew how to use it. And then it was necessary again during the Lechamp.
Mm-hmm. But what's so extraordinary is that we get the excursion, the Big Lost excursion about 500,000 years ago, right? And then we don't really have
starts.
Right. And then we don't have an excursion again until 160,000 years ago. And thankfully, people were using red ochre the whole time, which essentially prepared them for Pringle Falls.
Exactly. And then there's a huge spike in these red ochre or red paint people during, guess when? The Clovis period, which is one of the most difficult times to live on Earth, another mass extinction. And they're burying the people with this red ochre because they probably have it on. Everyone's got it on themselves.
Yeah, it's an essential part of life. So why would you not also be buried with that?
And are you ready for me to blow your mind? Take a look at this.
Yeah.
Did you see this?
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah. Yeah. It's very cool.
This is an artifact that's about 1.5 inches long. It's got carvings on it, and it dates to over 70,000 years old.
Yeah.
And the artifact is made of red ochre.
Mm-hmm. Clearly important.
What do you think that this is showing? I bet you it's some
know.
type of calendar. That's what I'm thinking.
Maybe.
Because red ochre's soft and you can scratch a line in it every day. It's like the way to keep track of something. You're keeping track of something. How many antelope you killed, how many times you beat your husband with a stick or whatever.
It's really hard to ascribe an interpretation to this, I think, right? Like it could be somebody doodling, it could be considered art, it could be a recording of some kind, like you suggested. I don't know that there's really any way to figure that out.
But at the same time, it is the most important cultural material that the entire world is using. It's a red ochre stick.
Right.
It's like a little stick. You break a little bit off, you smash it up in the pestle, and you add the water, however you do it. This is the main ingredient on how to survive on Earth.
Well, and by the way, I mean, it's also tremendously not surprising that red ochre becomes ritualistic because, I mean, imagine going through a magnetic excursion and things are kind of insane on Earth. And then there's this substance that's readily available to you that provides protection and allows you to live. Like, of course, you're going to ascribe great significance and perhaps spiritual importance to this substance. Like that, to me, that sort of says something about maybe why people were buried with red ochre. It's like, the things that the Egyptians buried with people to send them off into the afterlife.
Yeah.
Similar kind of concept.
And the reason it became so ubiquitous, imagine what's happening during these excursions. We've discussed this before. All of humanity is hiding in caves because they get burned when they go out in the sun. They don't know what's going on. Mm-hmm. Well, they've been hiding in caves, let's say for years, and then they see a tribe that's migrating around come by covered in the red ochre, and they're like, how the heck are they out there?
Right.
And then they learn about this substance, and quickly the whole Earth learns how to protect themselves.
Yeah. I mean, it would be really interesting to do some experiments on how much, let's say, protective effect red ochre provides in respect to UV, any kind of UV radiation, but also like cosmic ray radiation, any kind of radiation that would have been very high during an excursion. It'd be very interesting to do that. I wonder if anybody's done those experiments.
I have the paper right here.
Oh, well, this is for, SPF. Yeah.
Yeah. So they evaluated it, the solar, it's as good as anything we have today.
Right.
And could be the key to the number one question that everyone asks is, what do I need to protect myself from the radiation? It's like, there is no cosmic radiation suit, but there is red ochre.
Right.
It's easily to come by. You can buy the pigment today. They sell it. This company sells a cream. Where is it? Right here.
I would really love to see the evidence for protection against specifically like cosmic rays versus UV.
Yeah, the iron component. I'm wondering if the cosmic rays can hit the iron and be deflected.
Scatter. Yeah, I'm wondering that too. Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. So they make scrubs. It looks like this. There's the pigment. It's that simple. You could probably get a bag of it. You could probably buy it on the internet.
Yeah.
And it is a sunblock, and it's something that stores forever. It doesn't go bad. It is what it is.
Yeah. Well, and again, regarding the idea of like the iron potentially deflecting cosmic rays, it's very specific which ochre we're talking about, right? People were not seeking out yellow ochre or red ochre, or brown ochre. They're seeking the red ochre because apparently that's what works.
Fe3O4, hematite. That's the key.
Right.
So we should look into that.
It's reminding me too. I noticed some suggestions that in some of these papers that people were becoming like obsessed with the color red. Again, it's like, well, maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe it's not just some silly, unimportant obsession,
The Muslims dye their beards red with henna because the Prophet Muhammad was a redhead. Or was he? Is that just some whisper down the lane mistranslation of the use of red ochre?
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And so the red ochre culture is attributed to different cultures using the same terminology that aren't the same cultures. Let's be very clear.
Right.
It's so strange when you start to research this. You're like, so the red ochre people in Finland are the same as the Clovis people in New England?
Well, right. There's also the red ochre people of like the Great Lakes area, right? Like Wisconsin and Michigan and some parts of Pennsylvania. And I never see this mentioned, but I would argue New York as well, because apparently these people spoke some version of Algonquin, and the Algonquins lived in New York. There's a regular migration in that area of Native Americans as well as colonial people. Anyway, point being, like, the sun isn't necessarily particularly strong in those areas, and yet you have another group called the red ochre people using this.
And there is also the maritime red ochre culture, which is hypothesized to be a group of people that came from no particular country. They don't know where they're from. Hint, hint, Atlantis, that were highly advanced 13,000 years ago, traveling the seas in ships with advanced harpoon technology, blade, they're essentially ancient Vikings.
Right.
But their burial practices involved red ochre.
Just the fact that there are so many cultures around the world using this red ochre, again, points to A, how long this has been going on, and B, our global interconnectedness, despite the official narratives that was never the case.
Yeah, and here on the wiki, it says red paint people are pre-Columbian culture indigenous to New England and the Atlantic Canada regions of North America, probably a subset of the maritime archaic cultural complex. I just brought that up. Mm-hmm. And then the red ochre culture existed at the same time, but in different places. But the characteristic of the culture is its unique burial practices of using red ochre to decorate or cover the corpses of their dead. Mm-hmm. What if the bodies already had the red ochre on it? I mean, what are they talking about? Well, if everyone's rubbing red ochre in their hair and their skin, when you bury the guy covered in red ochre, he's going to be covered in red ochre.
Yeah, but I'm not entirely sure of this, but I thought I read this somewhere, that what they're finding is like, okay, a whole burial setup with other artifacts and all of this stuff. And it's not just like the person's covered in red ochre and it's rubbed off on the other stuff. It's that the whole site is covered in like a red ochre powder.
I bet you they take all the rest of that person's red ochre and put it in the burial because it's theirs. They ground it up. Yeah, that could be. It's their stuff, and you give them a little extra protection for the afterlife.
Right. Well, and the real test of whether or not it's like sprinkled on them or it's on their bodies would be, if it's on the body, it's going to be combined with animal fat, right? Because that's going to allow you to spread it on your skin versus just the powder itself.
Good point. But the red paint people and the red ochre people don't just date back 9,000 years, as the Wikipedia suggests.
Right.
This practice throughout the entire world and all cultures dates back 500,000 years. Mm-hmm. And we've been passing on the knowledge of how to survive magnetic excursions for the same amount of time. And it was the red ochre that did it. Mm-hmm. Well, and caves.
Well, and now we're just, willingly ignoring this knowledge, right? And saying, oh, it's just ritual. It's just hocus pocus, which is not going to serve us very well for the next excursion.
Yeah, so we'll try to get some red ochre in the store. I'd like to do that. Yeah, and maybe promote it.
Yeah. I'd kind of like to try it as a sunblock. I mean, obviously it works. I mean, I'd look pretty bizarre, but That'd be really interesting. It would be interesting to do that experiment and just cover myself in red ochre and go out paddle boarding somewhere and see how people react to a red person.
Yeah, well, let's go mine our own red ochre, and then we can sell our own sustainably harvested red ochre.
Yeah.
Fair trade. Non-GMO, gluten-free red ochre.
Okay. Because gluten is so important as far as things you put on your skin.
Okay, let's finish up the show on a fun topic. Not that that wasn't fun. But a new study suggests that there are galaxies which may be older than the currently accepted age of the universe. Let that sink in.
I just find the whole title to be ridiculous. But I'm biased based on what I believe, I suppose.
And this isn't a computer model either. This is an observational study.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, very rare today to actually do science.
Mm-hmm.
So the observational based study was led by Martin Lopez Corridora, something like that. He is a researcher at the Institute Astrophysics of the Canary Islands, and he found that certain distant massive galaxies appear to be older than the limit set by standard cosmology. The study was, go ahead.
No, please go ahead. Go on.
The study was published in the Astrophysical Journal, so it's peer reviewed and it's in one of the top journals. And it was based on the analysis of data recently obtained by the James Webb Space Telescope of galaxies that existed when the universe was between 4% and 5% of its present age, according to the accepted standard model of cosmologies. The researchers infer that the mean age of some of the galaxies would not be compatible with the accepted age of the universe, and also leave a caveat that they need an independent follow-up work to corroborate the conclusion.
Mm.
So they don't want to get canceled by astrophysics.
Right. Right.
They're just going to stay on the fence.
I mean, I don't know what this data is based on, but I'm assuming it's based on redshift, blueshift, which in and of itself has a lot of problems. So, I mean, somewhere I have a very interesting little article that explains the basic problems with redshift, blueshift. Maybe we should review that sometime. I think we did talk about it on the show once.
We could do a whole show on that, why it's incorrect.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So I mean, it could be too. It's like, you know, the standard cosmological model of the age of the universe being based on redshift, blueshift is flawed, and then you're using the flawed model to compare the accepted age of the universe to some other galaxies that you've now, based on redshift, blueshift, determined are even older. It's just like it's like a comedy of blunders that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well,
like it's just evolved into like not knowing anything about the quote unquote age of the universe.
Right. And what they do is when they look at the quote unquote edge of the universe with James Webb, the furthest we can look, what they're finding is galaxies that are estimated to be 900 million to 2.4 billion years old already at the edge of where it's zero time. So at the edge of where they're claiming the universe begins, there are galaxies that are so organized they have to be already 2.4 billion years old at the beginning of the universe. How is that? That makes zero sense.
Well, there's another problem here too, right? I mean, there's something called the event horizon, right? Which is as far as you can see, right? But that is based on the speed of light. It's limited by the speed of light. So there's no reason to suggest that that edge that we can see is the edge of the universe. There's an event horizon there. You can only see so far.
It's the edge of capability. That's it.
Right. So why are it's like, and this is not like a unknown or unaccepted concept, the event horizon. So I don't even understand why we're talking about the edge of the universe that we can supposedly see. I don't get it.
There clearly is a reason why humanity believes in fairy tales. I guess it's comfortable to have someone else tell you what's going on, and then you can just nod your head and go about your merry way.
I think that is a big part of it. I think there's a psychology behind saying, well, we have a general idea about how the universe works, and I think that it's not just comforting to hear that, but to be able to say that you can wrap your head around how all this works, and you know, so that therefore makes it more comfortable. I think things being unknown is very uncomfortable to people, so we like to just say we know something.
Right. And all this talk about disclosure coming up and the problems with it. Well, some of the whistleblowers claim that disclosure can never happen because the information that secret governments know is so mind altering.
Mm-hmm.
Humanity would be incapable of grasping it.
Mm.
So basically, it would be something so significant like the whole world is a simulation. It doesn't matter if you kill yourself or not. You're an infinite being, and these are just like, it would be something so crazy, just like, oh, so why am I working a job? Like people would not. They would go try to live off the land or something. They
Oh
would not be
God, we can't have
slaving
that.
away for these companies that hate them to destroy the earth. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I would agree with that kind of locking people into a certain belief system also locks them into essentially being your slaves.
Well said.
And I don't know if you have, I don't know if this is anyone's really sort of natural default position. I know it's mine, but I don't know how common that is. Like, I mean, I'm somebody that wants to learn all the time, and I am also really comfortable with not knowing stuff. You know, one of my favorite mantras is the more you know, the more you realize you don't know anything at all. I don't know how comfortable that is for most people. Um, and I think perhaps the elites just take advantage of the fact that all of that unknown can be very discomforting.
Well, what we do know is that the magnetic poles of Earth are rapidly moving. Just since 2000, they've moved the same amount in 20 years as it took over 100 years. So that is the shift. 5 times faster movement. It is now headed past the geographic North Pole into Siberia. And I think that the people that are keeping the whole world in the dark with their fake narratives and their fake stories know very well what's coming, that there is a time in the near future that they will lose power.
Yeah, well, think about this too. Like, okay, if keeping the general population within a certain belief system, like for example, the idea that the Earth is as it has always been, you know, that it's completely normalized, the climate doesn't change. So you keep them like stuck in this belief. And so then when you want something out of them, then when you want to control them in some way, that's when you scare the crap out of them, right? That's when you scare them with this anthropogenic global warming bullshit scare that creates people who are hysterical, right? Saying that we're all going to burn up in 5 years and my life is going to be over. Um, you know, it's a control mechanism because you can turn the comfort and the fear on and off. And it's probably not much different, let's say, for something like a magnetic excursion, right? We don't talk about this because I don't know that there's anything that you can gain out of the population by informing them of this and scaring them with it. Like, I don't know what are you going to, you know, climate change stuff, you can convince people to feel guilty for their very existence, but I don't know what you could possibly get out of people with trying to scare them about the magnetic excursion. Like, what could you possibly tell them that they should be doing in order to prevent this from happening? I can't even think of anything.
Well, yeah, and you can't blame them for making it happen.
No.
That's the problem. So they have to manufacture something that's your fault.
Right.
And that's the production of cow farts, human farts, and burning your fireplace.
Right. Right. So I suppose that you use the climate change hoax to, you know, control, scare and control people. Meanwhile, what's actually being prepared for is probably this magnetic excursion. You know, and so you're controlling the population in the meantime so that when this does happen, you have all of the controls in your hand.
Right. And you can then force humanity to do whatever you want if you are dangling the proverbial pickle on a string or whatever the hell you dangle on a string.
Right, right,
And so you can say, all right, everyone, we've gotten these smart cities set up. You can all come in and eat the bugs and we'll have internet for you.
Exactly.
Then you can plug into the matrix and be anyone you want to be.
Right.
Wow.
And then by virtue of doing that, you've got the majority of people sort of wrapped up and under your control and under your thumb. And then that makes it much easier to deal with the people who are outliers that don't fall for any of that. It makes it much easier to deal with people like us who will stay where we are and do our thing to survive.
Indeed, it's time to apply the red ochre.
We'll be the next red ochre. We'll start the new red ochre culture.
Yep, we'll be the new red paint people. We got to find a local source. Guys, great show. Thank you, Leah. And rewatch this tonight where?
Magnetic Reversal News on YouTube at 8 p.m. Mountain Time, 10 p.m. Eastern.
That's boom. Be safe. We love you.